Hello, I'm Michael Cantrell, and you are listening to the Prison Officer Podcast, a place to have a conversation about the forgotten cops that work in this country's jails, prisons, and correctional centers. A place for me to try to make sense of a career spent working inside the fence with some of the greatest people that nobody sees or recognizes for the important job they do to keep this world safe. If you love this podcast, hit the follow button, or better yet, share with your family, friends, or co-workers. Hello. So how'd you like the title? Was that a little bit of clickbait there? Me trying to get some attention? Yeah, it probably was. The thing is, it's not that far out of the realm of possibility. I did sit down the other day. I took a look at the job announcement for the director for the Federal Bureau of Prisons, and I think I'm qualified. I think I could put in for that. I did not get put in for it. I was busy this week teaching, which there's no love lost there. I'm not sure I wanted to pack up in retirement and move back to Washington, D.C., even if they did pick me. But what it did start a conversation with my wife and a couple of other friends who said, so what would you do? If you did get the director of the Bureau of Prisons, what would you do, Mike Cantrell? So I got thinking about that a little bit. What would I do if I was the director of the Bureau of Prisons? Well, first I want to start this off with kind of a disclaimer. I do have some thoughts about how the Bureau could get better. I'm not putting down anybody who is or currently was a director. It's not my place to do that, and that's not what this podcast is about. I do have some ideas about how the Bureau of Prisons could improve itself, and I'll talk to you about those. You know, I did work in D.C. for a little while. I was the chief of the Office of Emergency Preparedness, so I did get to see a little bit of what goes on at Central Office and a little bit of what goes on in Washington, D.C. I can't say that I came away from that experience feeling better about it, but I did see the way things work and some of the pitfalls that the Bureau has to overcome. And when I say pitfalls, I mean the distance between the people in charge and the officer who's working midnights in a seg unit somewhere in flyover America. There's a huge disconnect there, and that's probably the biggest thing in the Bureau of Prisons that we need to figure out how to overcome. You know, I no longer work for the Bureau of Prisons. I've been retired for a little bit. So some of these things may have changed, some may not. But I did make myself just a little list here that I'll go over, and I'll see what you guys think. Maybe we'll get some comments, and maybe you agree with me, maybe you disagree with me. But either way, I'm gonna give you what my ideas are, how I think the next director of the Bureau of Prisons could improve how the Bureau does things. And don't get me wrong, I love the Bureau of Prisons. I worked for them for more than 21 years. Tons and tons of great people work for the Bureau of Prisons. There's a lot of things that I think the Bureau of Prisons does that is on top of the game. They're considered, you know, one of the best prison agencies in the country, if not the world, especially over the last few decades when there's been so much growth, so much unchecked growth, starting back in the 1980s when we started building all the prisons. The Bureau lost a little bit of who it was, I think. That's me. I'm not disparaging the Bureau of Prisons. I'm not saying they're doing anything wrong, but I do have a list of things that I think they could do better, so that they could get back online with what I think taxpayers want. And at the end of the day, I think one of the main things that's forgotten with the Bureau of Prisons is that they don't work for the Attorney General or the President or whoever, whatever state senator has a federal prison in their district and has campaigned for that. That's not who the Bureau of Prisons works for, and it's one thing I never forgot. The Bureau of Prisons works for you. The Bureau of Prisons works for the taxpayer, and everything that we do should be competitive, should be frugal, and should be thought into how can we do a good job for the taxpayer. Now, the Bureau of Prisons is not the only ones with this problem. As we all know, the federal government is so bloated. The post office, you can go to any agency in the federal government and find this bloated department that spends money on things that we as taxpayers don't want them spending money on. And I'm not talking about salaries. I'm talking about programs and grants and all this stuff that doesn't work. It's just put out there. They're studying cow farts to see if it's, causing methane in the atmosphere. The general public doesn't want their tax money spent on that stuff. So the Bureau of Prisons is no different than these other agencies. I'm not just picking on them. I don't think our forefathers ever intended for these huge agencies to do things. I don't think our forefathers ever intended for there to be a federal Bureau of Prisons. Laws were done at the state level. It was, take a look at history. Our country started, 1776? The Federal Bureau of Prisons didn't even come along till, depending on who you talk to, 1895. I forget when the actual act was, but 1895, I think Leavenworth was the first federal prison, 1901, 1902. So for many years, we didn't need a federal prison system. It's when we started bringing the federal government in, controlling everything with the federal government, making all these federal laws, that somebody decided we need some place to put these federal inmates. And there was enough of them that we had to start our own prison system. So I just want you to know I'm not picking on the Bureau of Prisons. I love the Bureau of Prisons. But I do have some things that I think if, tomorrow if I wake up and somebody said, Mike, you're the director of the Bureau of Prisons today, I've got a few things that I would change. I made a little list here, so I'll just go through it and we'll talk about it. Number 1, inmates working. So when I started at Missouri State Pen for the Missouri Department of Corrections, the inmates at Missouri State Pen made soap, and that soap was for inmate use, and it was not only for inmate use at Missouri State Pen, it was for inmate use at the other prisons, Algoa, Church Farm, the different prisons around the state, and that was a good system. You had inmates working, making a product that was used by inmates in the rest of the system. But that's not where it stopped. And I may be wrong about this. Some of you may check me on this, but this is the way I remember it. Church Farm, which was another prison in the Missouri Department of Corrections, had a dairy. And they had dairy cows, and those inmates took care of those dairy cows, and they milked dairy cows, and they packaged milk, and that was sent out to the other prisons to use for inmates. I believe Wren's Farm, which was the female prison out on the Missouri River, Wren's Farm had where they grew vegetables. The female inmates out there had large gardens, a large area where they raised vegetables, and those vegetables were pushed out throughout the system. I'm wanting to say, and I may be wrong about this, but I think Algoa Correctional Center had beef, and I think they raised beef cows, and so there was meat, there was dairy, there was vegetables, there was soap. All of this was being made by inmates, incarcerated inmates who need skills, who need to work, and were in a way supporting themselves. My tax money wasn't going for soap for an inmate at Church Farm. My tax money wasn't going for a carton of milk or a glass of milk at Missouri State Pen. It was being done by these inmates for the inmates. It was saving the state money, and I thought it was a great program. Now, I don't know exactly when this happened, but at some point, from the way I understand it, a lawsuit was brought against the Missouri Department of Corrections saying that inmate labor wasn't fair, that it wasn't competitive with the local dairy farmers or the local beef producers or the local whoever that wanted their hand in this. And that was the reason that we don't do that anymore, was because of that lawsuit. That brought about these inmates not having as much to do. And in my opinion, they weren't learning skills to the level that they will 8 hours in a classroom or 4 hours in a classroom. When those guys got done with a day's work at Algoa Correctional Center or Church Farm Correctional Center, they knew they'd done a day's work, just like the rest of us that grew up on a farm. And they learned skills. Because on a farm, you're not going to learn just the skill of milking. You learn the skill of labor. You learn the skill of fixing mechanical things. You learn the skill of husbandry with the stock. So I think that was a bad thing when we did that. Now, here's what I know about the Federal Bureau of Prisons. So I went to work in 1999 at Leavenworth, and at that time they had Unicor, which is an entity that inside the Bureau of Prisons makes products and uses the inmate labor. And they pay the inmates, and things are made cheaper. Some things were made for export to, outside the prison system. Something like inmate uniforms were made inside the prison system and used inside the prison system. At that time, I know there was, what I remember, there was some military stuff being made. I think some backpacks and different web gear and stuff was being made. I remember that there was a print shop, and that print shop printed a lot of the forms and a lot of the notepads and stuff like that you see throughout the federal government, not just the Bureau of Prisons, but throughout the federal government. And at Leavenworth, Unicor was, I think, a 6-7 story building out there, and there were inmates working on every level. And during work call, while the inmates were working, when you'd go through the housing units, there were very few inmates laying around on their bunks. Now, everybody knows, your grandma told you idle hands are the devil's playground, and that doesn't change with inmates. If inmates don't have anything to do, they'll find something to do. Most of the time, it's not going to be good. So, fast forward here, I left Leavenworth in 2001, and several years later, I think it's about 10 years later, I got to come back and do a tour. I was there for training or something similar. And between the time I left and the time I came back, Leavenworth had changed missions. It was no longer a United States Penitentiary. It was an FCI, a medium. It still retained the USP in its name, United States Penitentiary, but the inmates that were there were medium security inmates, FCI inmates. And so when I went back in 10 years later and I walked through, the thing that struck me the most was every place I looked, inmates were sitting. And I got to asking around. I'm like, what is up with this? Why are these inmates inside sitting? Recreation was wall-to-wall inmates sitting against the wall. One of the other staff had told me that, Unicor, and I don't know the specifics of why Unicor either lost money or was forced to quit using the inmate labor, but Unicor was no longer employing as many inmates as it did back when it was a United States Penitentiary when I worked there. And I just remember the hair on the back of my neck just standing up, having that many idle inmates. That's a bad thing wherever you go. If you've got a prison with idle inmates, you've got potential problems. One of the first things I would do as a director would be put these inmates back to work. And I know that that's not something the director can do on his own. That's got to be done through Congress. And, it wasn't a BOP director that said we're not going to work the inmates anymore. But that would be one of the things I would push for the most. Whether you work with the senators and the congressmen or the president or whatever it need be, got to get these inmates back to work. Now, I don't mean chaining them to a rock and making them make big rocks into small rocks. There was a time for that in our history, I suppose, where that happened. But I'm talking about productive work that saves the taxpayers money, because that's what those inmates should be doing. They should be supporting themselves as much as possible inside those prisons. So that's one of the first things I would do, which is kind of, and I guess this will take me to number 2. Another thing I would do within the Federal Bureau of Prisons is I would get rid of a lot of the prison camps. I know that there's going to be a bunch of people say, "Oh my God, you're going to give up some jobs. You're going to, that wouldn't be good for the Bureau of Prisons." But what I can tell you is, just from my personal knowledge, prison camps at one time were in prisons that were near VA hospitals or near forts, military bases. And those inmates in those camps would go out and work. You used to see them all the time, mowing lawns and trimming trees and, out there with the string trimmer and keeping those manicured government facility lawns and that type of stuff. I mean, they did other stuff. But that was the type of work that we had those campers doing. Once again, those inmates need to be learning skills, real skills, not pretend skills. They need to be doing things that support themselves. We shouldn't be footing the tax bill for all of these at the level we are for these inmates. Yes, there's always going to be a certain amount of taxes that we pay. Anything that can be minimized, I don't care if it's a few $100s a year, should be done. That money should be looked at frugally. That's money that you brought home, that you worked for, that the government took, and now they're spending it on letting an inmate sit on his bunk instead of letting that inmate get up and earn some of his own money. So most of the camps these days, or I'm not going to say most, there's several camps out there that don't even have fences around them. The inmates are at such a low level that they're not considered a security risk. Nobody's going to put out, you're not going to see 30 or 40 sheriff's deputies and 30 or 40 Bureau of Prisons officers out there doing a manhunt for a walkaway camper. And in my opinion, if they're not a threat, then put an ankle monitor on them. Put an ankle monitor on them and put them at home. Close down these camps. Quit spending the money. And yes, it does cost money to house these guys in camps. They are not self-supporting. There's electricity, there's food, there's all this type of stuff that's taxpayers' money being spent on inmates who could be given an ankle monitor and put back out on the street. And if they're not eligible to be given an ankle monitor and put back out on the street, then by gosh, put them back behind a fence. But do one of the two. There's no sense having camps that inmates can walk away from. Either they're good enough to go home with monitoring, or they need to be put behind a fence. That's my opinion. So what else? Well, it's not just the inmates working. We need to get our staff back to work. And like I said before, a huge amount of the staff who work for the Bureau of Prisons are some of the best people I've ever seen. I've watched them work hard. I've watched them do things and stay late and go the extra mile to make sure things get done so that your tax money is well spent. But there is a percentage of staff who are not working, who don't do their jobs. There's staff out there who are union officials who've been on official time for years. They haven't stepped foot inside a joint. Or if they did, they go to the union office and they sit there. You're paying them to be a correctional officer or cook or a teacher or whatever it is, and they're not doing that. Somebody else is getting paid to do that job, probably overtime pay because they're short-staffed, while this person is on official union time. That's another thing I'd do. Union time, official time would be tracked. It would be tracked, and I would have somebody in charge of making sure that the official time that's being used by union members is necessary and is in the best interest of the taxpayers. And if it's not, then they don't need it. They work for the taxpayers too. I won't go a real long ways into some of the problems I see with the union, but I do know that the union spends a lot of time keeping some of the worst officers employed. And that's been going on for years. I'll tell you a quick story. So, had an officer one time, the staff had came in early, and it was early in the morning. They went to the housing unit looking for the officer. He wasn't there. They walked around the housing unit looking for this officer, couldn't find him. One of the inmates kind of tipped him off and pointed towards a mechanical closet, and so the staff went in there. They opened up the door, and this officer had taken a mattress and put it on the floor and was asleep. Of course, this is reported. He gets written up. This goes on up the chain. Discipline's coming. So I'm working during this time with one of the union presidents, and he said, well, I've got to go up front. So-and-so is in front of the warden today for discipline. I said, oh, good, and we'll get rid of him. He said, what? I said, you're going to fire him, right? He said, oh, no. I'm going to go up there and stand with him, make sure that they don't fire him. I need to stand up for him. I said, who's going to stand up for me? That officer abandoned his post. It wasn't like he nodded off in a chair in the corner, okay? I've seen officers do that, and you kick their chair and you go, hey, bud, wake up, go get a cup of coffee. That happens. This guy took a mattress off an inmate bunk, laid it down in a mechanical room, and went to sleep. He abandoned his post. He put that whole prison in jeopardy, in my opinion. And that's why I told the union president, I said, who's standing up for me? I said, you're going up there to stand up for him, but who's standing up for the guy doing his job? Who's standing up for the guy who didn't abandon their post, who was put in jeopardy because of this guy's attitude and his lack of work ethic? And he didn't have an answer for me, and he did. He went up front, and they did. They saved that guy's job. He got some discipline, but came back to work and quit later on. But that was the kind of stuff that I saw with the union that I never could stomach. They never stood up for the person who was doing their job. Every time I saw them go up front or I dealt with them in the administrative level, they were protecting people who didn't do their job. Now, granted, there was a place for the unions, and there probably still is a place for the unions. But everything that happens inside that prison, inside the Federal Bureau of Prisons, and even the one of the state prisons, that's taxpayer money, and it needs to be taken care of. And I don't believe that a lot of the union officials understand that we're supposed to be taking care of taxpayers' money. We're not supposed to be protecting the people who don't do a good job, the people who can't be trusted, the people who abandon their post and put other people in jeopardy. So, yeah, that's one of the, I may have went off topic just a little bit there, but that's another thing that I would, probably step out there and do, is rein a lot of that in. There's a place for the union, but the union's place is not to get by with doing nothing. My opinion, probably get a couple of good thumbs downs for that, but that's okay. So what else would I do? Well, kind of along this same line is performance appraisals. I've been watching performance appraisals for years, including my own. And I'm not going to lie to you, I played the game well, and I got good performance appraisals throughout my career. Now, I believe I was a hard worker, and I deserved some of it, but the way the performance appraisal system is set up is flawed, and it's broken. And part of that falls back to the union and the way that they have gotten things enacted over the years. But the performance appraisal system in the Federal Bureau of Prisons is tied directly to your pay. So here's the problem. If I get a certain level, if I get one of the high levels of performance, that year I'm eligible to go up a step. I'm eligible to get paid more. As supervisors, If you don't give somebody a good performance appraisal, you're taking money out of their pocket. You're taking money that they could have out of their pocket. So a lot of supervisors won't do that. When you take a look overall at the performance appraisal system, an absurd number of staff are at the top level. Now, if we just go out here in the general public, I don't care if you go to McDonald's, I don't care if you go to the Chevy dealership down the road, and you take 10 employees, okay? Let's just take 10 employees because it's easy math. How many employees do you have who are outstanding? Out of every 10, 1, maybe 2, okay? If you've got a good thing going, you've got 1 or 2 outstanding employees who do what they're supposed to, do above what they're supposed to, come up with new ideas, and make it a great place to work. So how many exceeds, how many excellent, whatever you want to call it, superior, how many excellent employees do you have? A couple more? So that gives you 4. That gives you 4 employees in the top that do more than average, okay? Those 4 do more than average. They're above and beyond. They're at work every day. They're the employee that everybody wants. So how many average employees should you have? Shouldn't most of them be average? Shouldn't you say like maybe 5 employees should be average out of 10? That's half your employees. I don't know. Maybe somebody will argue with me. So right there is 9 of your 10 employees that are average. So that only leaves 1 employee that can be fair or poor. Now, I'm not a genius, and I live in the same world you do, and I go to McDonald's once in a while. Are you getting excellent, superior, outstanding service every time you go to McDonald's? No, but that's a bad example, because we're not going to compare Bureau of Prisons employees to McDonald's employees. So let's look at a bank. Let's look at a corporation. Do you think a corporation has 40% of its employees that are above average? 90% of their employees are average or above? Only 1 employee out of 10 is fair to poor? I don't believe that either. If you take a look in the Federal Bureau of Prisons, you're going to see that 60% of the staff are outstanding, are excellent, are above average. Another 30% are average, and 10% is below average. That's what the performance appraisals that you're going to see are going to show you. And that's just not the truth. The people that work there, the people that have oversight, the people that just have common sense and work anywhere else in the world know that that's not true. But we do that because nobody wants to take money out of somebody's pocket. It feels bad as a supervisor. You can't get promoted with an average rating. You can't get more money with an average rating. The only way you can get promoted or get money in your pocket or get a raise is to get this above average rating. So everybody gets above average ratings. That's a broken system. So there's another item that I would work on, is getting this performance appraisal system put together to where it's an actual reflection of the work that's going on. Now, those that exceed and go above and beyond should be rewarded. And the average worker should be rewarded at a lower level. And those employees that aren't making the cut, we need to help them to improve. We need to put them in a position to get better. Or we need to move them on down the road. You should be training, hiring, employing the highest level of employee in these law enforcement positions in the federal government. And we don't always do that. So that's my thought there on performance appraisals. So let me talk about this. I'll tell you another thing, that the Bureau of Prisons often wonders why things don't change. And The Bureau of Prisons has had a director who came from the Bureau of Prisons since pretty close to the beginning. Okay? Someone who worked in the Bureau, understood it. That has its positives and that has its negatives. So a few years ago, 2016, 2017, I don't remember exactly, but the Attorney General named an outsider as the new director of the Bureau of Prisons. And his name was Mark Inch. He was a retired U.S. Army general, and he had worked in the detention areas of the Army for many years. They brought him in. Of course, he had a lot of detention experience with the U.S. Army. I don't remember exactly where he worked, but he had oversaw much of the military's detention programs for a few years. So they brought him in as the director of the Bureau of Prisons as an outsider. Unfortunately, that didn't last very long. He retired, I think it was about a year, moved on to the Florida Department of Corrections, which he just, I believe, retired from there the end of this last year. But that was the first time an outsider had been brought in as director. So here we are again. Is the new Attorney General going to bring an outsider into the Bureau of Prisons? Well, there's good and there's bad with that. I do agree that a person who comes from within the Bureau of Prisons understands the culture, understands the scale, the size of the Bureau of Prisons. A lot of people don't understand that the Bureau of Prisons has 122 prisons out there, scattered all over the country. So this is a big job. But bringing somebody from the inside also brings people who may not want to change the culture of the Bureau of Prisons, who may be resistant to change. There are good ideas out there. A lot of corrections agencies do a lot of good stuff. They have some great ideas, and the Bureau of Prisons doesn't, own the patent on all the good ideas in corrections. But sometimes they're resistant to gravitate and grab onto those new ideas. And what I saw for a long time, we don't reach outside of the Bureau of Prisons to learn. And when I say that, what I'm talking about is if you're the CEO of a big corporation and you want to bring in your top, executive level staff and you want to give them some training, you're not going to have someone from that executive level staff give that training. You're going to reach outside. You're going to have Jocko Willnick come in. You're going to have Simon Simic come in. These guys who, excel in teaching leadership. That's who you're going to have teach leadership to your executive staff. The Bureau of Prisons refuses to do that. When they bring in somebody to teach their wardens, they bring past wardens. When they want somebody to teach captains, they bring past captains. And what that does is continue a culture of, it worked for me, it'll work for you, we don't need to change anything. And so that's why they are so resistant to change. We need to reach outside the Bureau of Prisons and bring in some new ideas, some new thoughts. I do want to say one thing. One of the things I credit my good career to, my promotions and my being able to have new ideas and become a training instructor that I think was respected, I credit a lot of that to my wife, Catherine. For many years, and we didn't have a lot of money, but for many years she would let me go sign up for this leadership class or this tactical class or this class outside of the Bureau of Prisons. I would go take those classes and I would get to meet people from outside the Bureau of Prisons. I would get to see techniques and stuff from outside the Bureau of Prisons, and I brought those back with me. Some of those were adopted, some weren't, but overall it made me a better teacher. I didn't just stand in front of the class and teach BOP. I stood in front of the class and I taught corrections. This was the knowledge I had of more than one place. This was the knowledge I had of this agency and that agency, and this agency's doing that, and they've been doing this over here for a while. And I was able to bring that in to have a range of knowledge, not just a focused knowledge about what my perceived job is from the Bureau of Prisons. but a range of knowledge from my experiences and my training that I got to do outside. And I thank my wife for that. She was always very supportive of that, and I know at times that took money out of our household budget in order for me to do some of those things. But I think in the end it paid off, and now I get to instruct a lot. So I guess the one more thing I'll talk about that I would probably change is inmate programming. Now, it's not that we don't spend enough money. The Bureau of Prisons spends a ton of money on inmate programming. But I don't think that we're taking a look once again outside of the Bureau of Prisons to see some of the things that are working. We're doing the same things over and over again and expecting different results with these inmates. When these inmates are getting ready to get out, it's time to prepare them. It's time to go get them some real jobs. It's time to teach them how to support themselves. And I'll say, there's lots of programs out there, but when I worked at Ozark Correctional Center, I saw a program that I thought worked very well. And inmates who were getting close to release were housed at Ozark Correctional Center, and they would get jobs in the community. Now, granted, there were some inmates who worked on the highway crew. They picked up trash, which I think every Department of Corrections in all 50 states should have a highway crew picking up trash. There's no reason our highways should look like they do while we've got inmates sitting in bunks. But that's my opinion. So we had inmates on the highway crew. We had inmates who helped the fire department. I think there were inmates who worked for the county. But some of the inmates worked at, one was a chicken factory that processed chicken. One was a paint factory that made paint. And these inmates would go out and they would work. We provided the bus. We had a driver, that worked corrections. He'd pick them up in the morning. He'd drive them to the work site. He'd stay with them, and he'd bring them back. And there might be anywhere from 10 to 40 or 50 inmates who would go out to these places to work. And they were employees of those places. So they could be fired. They could be promoted. They could be moved around. They weren't just stuck doing the worst tasks. They were actual employees. And these inmates excelled, a lot of them. The state had a program to where a quarter of their pay came back to the state to pay for transportation and lodging and probably the officer's, salary that took them back and forth. So there was a quarter of it. A quarter of it went to the state's victims fund, from the way I understood it. And then a quarter of their pay went on their commissary books. That was for them to buy, Zoom Zooms and Wham Whams and all the good stuff at the commissary, chips and sodas and that kind of stuff. And then the last quarter of their money on a savings account. Now, some of these inmates stayed at Ozark Correctional Center for, as I remember, a couple of 3 years, some of them were there for 6 months. But the ones that stayed there for an extended amount of time, they would leave that correctional center when they were paroled or put on probation. And they would leave that correctional center, and I remember some of them had $20,000 saved up. Now, when you think about an inmate who's been, some of them for 10 years, 15, maybe more, going back into society, I remember being at Missouri State Pen, and inmates who had 30, 40 years at the maximum security, time was up, you couldn't keep them any longer, and they'd walk them out the front door. And they'd give them a new coat. They'd give them, whatever money was on their commissary, which was $10 or $15 sometimes, and say, don't come back. Well, of course that inmate's coming back. He doesn't know how the world works anymore. And I don't think we do that as much now. That was 30 years ago. But even those camp inmates, you got $20,000 in your pocket, you can pay first and last month's rent on a new apartment. You can go buy a cheap car. You've got money to pay your utilities for a few months. And that's where I think we don't do a good job, is giving those inmates that opportunity to make it. We put them back out sometimes in the same neighborhoods with the same thing in their pocket that they left with and expect them to do something different. And they're not going to. They're going to do whatever they have to survive, and most of the time they're going to do what they know because they don't have other choices. But the programs and stuff that give them money in their pocket, that allow them to grow and gain skills and gain vocation, are the ones that are going to work. Now, I know there's a bunch of you out there, and I'm the same way. You're going to tell me that, a lot of them, it doesn't matter what you do. And you're right. We could do everything in the world to help some of these guys, and at the end of the day, tomorrow, they're going to go right back into prison. There's no doubt in my mind. Recidivism is always going to be there. There's guys that just don't get it. But for the ones that do, we should provide those programs that work. And for the ones that don't, they should be earning their way through prison, not using my tax money to get through there. So when I think about what I would do, if tomorrow I wake up and I'm the next director of the Bureau of Prisons, that is some of the things that I would focus on. Saving the taxpayers' money, putting the inmates back to work, putting the staff that don't work back to work, making them responsible for the taxpayers' money that's paying their salary. And I think those are easy concepts. I think those are easy things to do. Now, I expect to get some feedback on this, but it was kind of fun thinking about this, and I hope you had a good time listening to me ramble on about what I would do if I was the next director of the Bureau of Prisons. Have a good night. If you enjoy these podcasts, the best way to support the Prisoner Officer Podcast is to share these episodes with your friends or family on social media. Let me invite you to visit www.theprisonofficer.com. If you haven't already, check out the Prison Officer Podcast on Facebook and click that little follow button. Or leave us a message, or better yet, leave us a review. And if you're listening to us on Apple Podcasts, Google, or Spotify, please click the subscribe button. Till next time, I'm Mike Cantrell. Watch your back, and please take care of each other out there behind those walls.